So hi, Patricia. It's great to have you on. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle. It's great to be here.
I always like to start by going backwards, Patricia. We're forward thinking, we're the education revolution, but you can't move forward before you look back. And education, teaching and learning is not something that we all make our way through unscathed, as children. When we go through it, sometimes people who have experienced the education system in a positive way, maybe go into education like ourselves professionally. So what was your experience with education as a child, and how did teaching and learning become something that you wanted to eventually work in as a field?
Great question to start. Actually, I totally agree with what you're saying about like the way you've experienced the educational system really impacts sort of the way you think about it, and you see it as like a positive or maybe a negative type of force on your life. So for me, I was kind of like, typical born and raised in France with like parents who are two engineers, lots of books in the house. There are books behind me. So I feel like I was already sort of like growing up in a context that was, let's say, pro-education. And I would say more than that, pro-education system, where like the education system was seen as something that would be like valuable, that would sort of equip yourself for skills for life and for work in particular. So I think for me, school was always a rather positive thing. And the system itself was like a way to kind of like grow up, get the skills I needed, and then explore my passion in a way that's also sort of like an adult type of like, success story, be in the workforce. So yeah, I think for me, it was very positive actually.
Because it's funny, because sometimes those two narratives don't always interject. This idea of school being framed in the household, because I came from an immigrant household, European, Eastern European, and then Indian, South Asian. And there was that very heavy emphasis on school is your job, and school is work. School is important. It's going to help you, reach the places and spaces that you want to in life. But sometimes we get that narrative in our homes, and then we go into the classrooms, and it can be quite repressive and robotic. Did you find joy in learning as a child, or did you frame it as this is important and I know that this is going to help me, and so I'm going to get through it, as smoothly as possible? Or were you able to find joy in the teaching and learning process?
I think for me, that question really is about, what I actually moved a lot as a child. So for my parents' work, I had to kind of live in different cities, and I experienced lots of different schools. So it really depended on sort of what the actual context was and who the teachers were. Anything that, like I wouldn't be able to say like I enjoyed like all of it, but I would say most of it. And what I enjoyed the most were people that were able to kind of like grab my attention and make me feel like whatever was being taught was relevant. And I think that was the thing that I thought was the most maybe valuable, is to connect what was being taught and why it was important. Like I was all about the why should we care? How is this going to be relevant to either me or the world? I've always been kind of interested in like the impact of things. So for me, the teachers that were able to connect, like what the content was and why it mattered were the best ones. So I think I probably had quite a few good teachers. I also had some that, like made me feel very stressed or very inadequate, or feeling like I wouldn't just not be able to learn to the extent that they wanted. But then I think in my mind, I kind of discarded that as like, well, that's not something that's going to be helpful to me anyway. So I had a slight sort of sometimes like maybe like in my mind I was choosing what mattered and what didn't. So maybe a little bit of agency there within the system that I sort of inserted.
Well, and also your researcher mindset was kind of already you were already primed as a researcher, looking at school and the different schools, being in Europe and traveling around to different systems, being able to be like, okay, well, this is working. This is what I'm gravitating to. This isn't working. I'm going to kind of, follow the findings, as it were, and move through. Let's continue on this journey and map it a little bit further along the line here around education and work now. So you went through the system. You were able to almost approach your experience of the system from this analyst strategist kind of perspective. How then did teaching and learning follow you into your professional career as an industry?
So it's interesting. Like my initial interest professionally was I wanted to be bettering the world. I mean, I was one of those like teenagers that was particularly interested in sort of economic development in sort of the rest of the world. So my mother actually is from Madagascar. She moved to France when she was 15. And as an engineer, she first wanted to kind of create or invent an engineer in agriculture, like rice that would feed the people. So her story really impacted me, and I was thinking, well, I'm going to use other means like economic policy, like how to like use money to like relieve poverty in the developing world to make my career. So I kind of oriented myself towards like policy and an international development angle. And one of the things that is interesting is I did that, and I sort of like ended up by chance, I guess, sort of being in courses in university that were talking about all of those fundamental sort of pillars of development, of economic development. And a lot of it had to do with the legal system, with the financial system, with the social system, and education. So I just felt to me like, once again, like education is something that's so fundamental to well-being of like countries and people, that it just felt like that's something that I can get behind. And I feel like this is an area where if I work in this area, I can kind of like contribute to my big goals. For different reasons, I ended up working more in countries that are not developing countries. So I've been spending, like more than 5-6 years in the OECD, where like like the Economist always calls the OECD the rich country club, which I take issue with a little bit because there's a lot of diversity of economic levels in the OECD membership. But generally, yeah, I've been sort of like trying to implement that interest in an international context. And education has been, I think, is a great vehicle for improving societies.
So this economic background in your household, and engineers, engineers are unique folks. And that idea of building and structure and systems, engineers sometimes have that unique capability of holding the forest and the trees together, right? Like the moving parts are all part of something bigger. And so you have those influences, and then being a person driven by purpose and having this purpose be circled around development, this idea of equity. And then you have, when you pull on equity, and then you see, when you start to unpack, and again, we all talk about systems on this podcast, it's all about how everything interconnects. So once you start to look at development, you're pulling on things economic, social, political, and all the spheres of society. And then they look at factors or levers that you can pull in terms of influencing these factors in society, education being one of the biggest levers you can pull. So you're like, all right, if I pull this lever, the domino effect is what it is. All of these kinds of elements of my past and things related to my purpose are going to fall. And I want to just, on this moment where we the work that you say, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, hugely international organization. We're talking, as we zoom out here and we start talking about economic development, reduction in poverty across the world, we want to look at educate. Why do you think education is such a linchpin? Why is, because people tend to get very microcosmic and say the classroom, that's what education is. And people like you and I, we see education as a potential for huge global shifts. Can you maybe double click on that, and how you see education as this lever? Like, what is it about this thing we do called teaching and learning, Patricia, that ends up being so important for these broader global systems?
So that's, I think it's super complex, obviously, but like for me, like what comes through that is that education is the opportunity for people to kind of actually extract themselves from whatever they were born in, whatever they've been told, or, like sort of shaped by their particular context. So that's the kind of ultimate sort of like emancipation opportunity. And I think that's why education comes as this sort of like fundamental way of freeing people. So that's maybe going into a bit philosophical, but concretely speaking, if you're born in a family where, like you don't necessarily have like parents who are educated, are as lucky as I was, like the school the education system is where you might be able to kind of like grab onto that. And actually coming from a family where like, having also like a lot of immigrants in my family, like they all have, I saw, succeeded through the education, through going through the education system. So for me, education is a way of changing your life and then succeeding. So it is a very effective individual lever. And then at a societal level, if you're looking at it more broadly, I think it's one of the main tools that, as a group, we can sort of put forward some of the things that we think are important. And so besides, let's say, like equipping someone for personal success in their career, in their job, as a society, if we care about certain things, like let's say, climate change, like the education system is the place to start to familiarize and sort of provide like little tools and ideas about how important that is to kids. So for me, like there's a kind of like dual purpose for education, like personal growth and freedom, and then at the same time, like shaping our societies and making sure that the citizens that we're going to be kind of growing, so to speak, have some kind of like introduction to some topics that maybe they would have just never heard about elsewhere.
And methods of thinking. So
exactly.
When I start thinking, the big word I wrote in the middle of my page while you were talking was, well, this idea of education as fuel. So education, and there's that famous quote where it's, I'm not filling a vessel, I'm lighting a spark, that's education is about sparking, fueling, inspiring, and also creating some of that capital, tangible social capital that you can then go out and spend in the world vis-a-vis a degree, a diploma, a certificate, a credential, a badge. That really is interesting to me because not only is there this kind of intangible systemic effect, which is motivational, purpose-driven, fueling the individual, no matter their circumstances, obviously within the constraints of a systemically structure that's personified some of those mechanisms of discrimination. But there's a potential for this individual catalyst through education, and then societally, the decisions that we make about what we teach and how we teach have the potential. We'll just say potential, Patricia. Not necessarily exemplified all systems of education or at all levels of a system of education, but this I love talking about these lofty goals, philosophy, purpose is to produce societal fuel, if you will, in terms of these individuals going into the society, spending that capital, but having capital like critical thinking, intelligence, and those concrete skills, technical skills, domain-specific skills that they can go in and leverage in a workforce. Staying at this high level in terms of some of the experiences that you've had, so the OECD, an incredible driving force for some of these systemic ways of thinking that you've described. You've also worked for the government of Ontario, and there's a couple keywords I wanted to pull out of your job descriptions because I love how the senior policy advisor for the Ontario government, and within the strategic policy division, Patricia. Strategic policy division. Can you, for the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities, can you describe to us exactly with these government roles? Because not only to better understand the system and how this lever gets pulled in the realities of economic, social, and political structures, but also to share with people listening. I think it's always important to see education and jobs in education is very diverse. So yes, you could be a teacher, you could be a consultant, you could be a learning designer, which straddles the technical space. You could be a strategic policy advisor. So what is it when someone thinks of a role like that, Patricia? What is it that makes it strategic? And what do we mean really when we say policy?
So I think that's a great question. I think a lot of people are wondering about the black box of government and just finding what are those people doing? Like what kind of product that are coming out? And I always found it to be quite difficult to explain what my job was. But frankly, the thing is like the policy person or advisor or policy analyst is sort of like the linkage between, on the one end, the politicians that are basically elected to do something, and oftentimes it's very lofty goals, like improve our education quality or improve access to education. And then the politician is on that side of the equation, promising a lot of like great things. And on the other end, the kind of mechanics of the system and the very concrete actors and tools that are making up the system of education. And that means, like the schools, the universities, the colleges. So you're kind of like, as a policy advisor or an analyst, you're sort of sitting in between and you're trying to think about like, how are we going to achieve some of the big goals? Let's say, for example, like I remember like when I was in government, one of the goals was to increase the attainment rate, so the sort of higher education attainment rate, to 70% of the population of like a particular like class, age class. So the idea was, how do we increase access tremendously, knowing that we have the system that we have? Like, what are the things we can do like at the system level to increase access? So then your job is to kind of look at all the possible levers that you have available in the government. Some of it is money. So you spend a lot of time thinking about how much money do you need to put into the system to bring on more students. Maybe you need to kind of fund schools so that they can accept more people. Maybe you need to hire more teachers, and that also costs money. So there's a kind of financial lever. There's also the whole idea of like, how do you define what the success of the system really looks like concretely? So as a government, you're going to say, well, like school and universities and colleges need to equip people with skills that we believe we need in our economy. So we need to start talking about that as a policy person, to say, well, actually, like these are skills that employers that make up like our economic sort of landscape need to have, and we fund you with public money to deliver people that will be able to actually contribute. So then you're kind of like saying, that's when you make the linkages between there's money, there are goals. How do you articulate that? So I find that one of the things that I try to use to explain what is it that we do as policy makers is that we are there to translate the ideas into action and to kind of incentivize the actors to actually contribute towards the big goals that have been set up by the people, by the politicians that are sort of supposed to be expressing that. So
it's true. Now it's you did a great job of explaining the black box of policy workers. It is. So if I'm hearing you correctly too, this idea of strategic is systems level. So when you're dealing at the strategic level, you're dealing at the systems level. So you're seeing different components and how they feed into it. And then policy, looking at turning, like you say, policy turns ideas into action. And a huge part of that is incentivizing the actors in the actions.
Exactly.
Excellent. And then on that note, there was also another position that you held that talked about interjurisdictional relations. And as we know, we're gonna move to the world of innovation in a second, but people are some of our most wonderful human resources. The human resources are some of our most wonderful resources. At the government level, sometimes when I feel like when we zoom out to the systems level or talk strategic policy decisions, we start to operate in silos, which is really counterintuitive in terms of we're trying to think at a systems level. But now that we're so up here, people who handle their sections want their sections and their people in their sections and their money to connect, but in a way that serves them. So what exactly, how did you embody collaboration or connection, interdepartmental connections? And because when we talk about the education revolution a lot, Patricia, people on this podcast are talking about making connections between different teachers. If you're talking at the school level, if you're teaching English, talk to other teachers teaching English. If you're introducing a new technology, talk to people who've used that technology. How, in your experience at that strategic systems level, working on government policy, how did collaboration or interjurisdictional work? What did it look like? How did you make it happen? It's okay if it didn't always look great. It's okay.
Well, one of the things that's funny about that, well, I mean, I've worked in like interdepartmental and interjurisdictional roles, like sort of at sort of various levels. So, like when I was in strategic policy, I was trying to foster collaboration across like different parts of the ministry. So, the part that works on university, the part that works on like capital expenses, the part that works on like, like performance measurements. I had to broker that kind of relationship. Then I worked in interjurisdictional, like you say, and that was across Canada. So, and then I worked internationally and I was across countries. But the interjurisdictional collaboration was very interesting because it was all about trying to align people on a sort of common goal without completely diluting what the common, let's say, output becomes. Because the biggest issue when you're trying to collaborate is that obviously people have different interests. And so they have a very low common denominator that they're all willing to go for. So the biggest issue there was kind of like, okay, so how can we combine like some kind of like consensus led approach where we bring as many people as possible on board without doing something that basically is just a statement of intention. And full disclosure, in the world of interjurisdictional affairs, a lot of it ends up being a statement of intention. And I'm sure, following like how hard it is to craft a common communique in diplomacy, oftentimes that's all you manage to get through. What I found was really helpful is to kind of find, in my job, was to find like what was the interests and the sort of like, what was the sort of expected outcome for each of the parties. So my job was a lot of like, doing research to understand, like if I was working with, like British Columbia, like in the Canadian context, or Quebec, like what are they interested in? What do they want to get out? What are their problems? Like so that I could try to find some more tangible commonality that we can kind of all rally against, and then not try to be in agreement about everything else. Just try to focus on that tangible piece. So I think a lot of the collaboration, it has to be very concrete and very specific and responding to need. Like just collaboration for the sake of it is an incredibly fatiguing type of endeavor, as I mean, all of your guests here are, I'm sure, like completely experiencing. So
and the other side too, this idea of intention around focused on the user, not on the facilitator, right? Because and this is true. The process that you just described is true if we want to get two students to collaborate in a classroom. It's true if you want to get two countries or two provinces to collaborate. Starting with the collaborators, the tours, and what are they interested in? Let's tap into some intrinsic motivation so that we're not continuously hitting our heads against the wall. And then can we tie that intrinsic motivator to some kind of common ground across participants, across stakeholders? So important. And then we talk, but it's the same thing, whether we're trying to build and then you pulled on you use a really interesting word, consensus, which I'm going to pull now. As we start to get into some of the interesting, from the systems to the more specifics, the word innovation. So let's say we're trying to build a collaboration. We're trying to find what incentivizes people, what's a common intention that we could build and move towards some common ground. When we talk about innovation, I always like to first start by defining what we mean, because you could go into a room of 5 people over here or 5 people over there, and the definition you come out with of innovation is different. So for you, Patricia, and this could be at Sandbox Inc. now, working where you work now in the digital media production realm, what is innovation to you? It could be an integration of your work over time as well. You don't have to be specifically in the Sandbox arena, but what is innovation to you?
So I think for me, like the idea of innovation, which by the way, like it's a tricky concept to work with because it's being thrown around so much. And I think it's kind of like reached a point that everything falls into it. Like every kind of like experience that we have is a new experience just because of the pace of change. So it's a bit complicated because for me, innovation is basically everywhere. Like we're all trying to adapt ourselves to new situations, to new tools, to new people. So the way I see it is that, innovation is about like finding new approaches to address, let's say, problems that we have, like existing problems that we have, or using maybe existing approaches to address new problems, like things that are emerging. And I'm thinking in particular about how we all had to adapt to the pandemic, sort of forced remote, and how that was a new problem. And we tried to address it with some of our existing tools because we couldn't create a tool like overnight. So we tried to find, for me, that's innovation. And then there's a sort of like, the ultimate innovation where you're trying to kind of like tackle new problems with new approaches. And that's where I'm swimming in Sandbox, which is a very fun, innovative place because it's tackling new problems, complex problems that we don't fully understand yet, with a mix of methodologies predicated on the idea that if we mix methodologies, we might be more effective than just you going at it with one tool. And I like that in general. I mean, working in research, you kind of like come to a point that it's not going to be any kind of research design that works other than a mixed method research design. Like it just feels that, relying exclusively on the massive surveys in the OECD, we were doing that. Those are amazing. They're extremely sound. They're comprehensive. They're validated. But if you don't sort of complement it with another way of thinking, another approach, whether it is some specific interviews with people or whether it is some like review of like, results from policy experiments, like something else, you're just not going to get the full picture. So for me, like that's one of the things about innovation that is one of the trickiest things is how do you, in this complex world with new needs all the time, how do you use different methods and make them kind of like complement each other to find like the way of addressing the new problem? So that's a bit convoluted, but I feel it's like, new problems, new approaches. How do you match that up?
No, amazing. And it's funny because when you think of that, new problems, new approaches, adaptability, this idea of novelty, problem solving, when we think of these levels, and of course, these are not just binary, there's not just up and down, but this idea of policy and the systems level, strategic decision-making happening up here, this isn't where innovation happens. Where we respond to innovation, where we have to make strategic decisions to support and put in place structures that facilitate the kind of work happening down here, in your case, in the literal sandbox. So when we're playing and we're trying new things and we're putting old solutions on new problems and trying, okay, that didn't work. Down here in the front line, service provision, service design and development space, prototyping, product dev spaces, this is where innovation happens, and then we move it up the chain and say, okay, this is interesting, this is seeping into our culture now. Uber, we no longer have taxis only. Uber is now, ride sharing is now a way that we do things. So, and then we have to figure out how do we create policies that to respond to the change and the innovation happening down here. So let's dive in to the innovation sandbox over here a little bit, Patricia. That's just part one of this exciting conversation, my friends. Click on part two and continue with us on this important journey we like to call the education revolution.